Hello and welcome to the Deep Sea podcast, Pressurised, a short, punchy version of our main feed that gets right to the scientific point. If you like what you hear and you'd like to hear the full episode, you can find it in the same feed. And now, to get right to the point. So, if we're discussing big, fishy distributions and figuring things out and filling in the dots and the gaps, we've recently rediscovered a legend
We have.
that we can have a chat with.
Today, our guest is a true legend in deep sea biology. So we've crossed paths once before. So in March, all the way back in March 2001, our old boss, Monty Pried, pulled this fine chap out of retirement for one last hurrah on the RRS Discovery to teach us all how to bottom trawl. And so this was his last ever trip at sea. And it happened to be my first ever trip at sea. So as you can imagine, I'm 25 years old and sent out to North Atlantic as a young mechanic to basically operate loads of crazy experiments for Monty and experiencing life at sea for the first time, I guess. It was a pretty cool time. So within the scientific part was this guy. I was told he was a legend, but I was only actually in science for like 4 months or something at this point, right? So I'm like, okay, whatever. And it was really cool. I remember watching him orchestrate the launch of an OTSB trawl, which is a big bomb trawl, ultra trawl, semi-balloon trawl, to about 4,800 meters, which is pretty wild for your first trip. And it was cool sort of watching him in the wet lab working his magic and all these deep sea fish with his new wife at the time, Colleen. So I guess it was a few years later when I started studying deep sea fish properly and writing papers that you couldn't escape this guy's name. It's one of those guys who comes up all the time, right, whenever we're doing anything at all. And so I realized that it was, pretty cool to have spent some time, although I didn't realize at the time how much of a legend he really was. So before I introduce him, let's look at his credentials. His first job was with the National Institute of Oceanography as a biologist on Britain's last whale factory expedition to the Antarctic. Then he joined the East African Marine Fisheries Research Organisation in Zanzibar to work on the potential for local exploitation of tuna and marlin stock using longlines. And then there was the revolution in Zanzibar. In 1968, he returned to the National Institute of Oceanography to work on deep sea fishes, where he began working on midwater fishes, but eventually gravitated to deep sea fish in 1974 and continued on that line until he retired in 1999. The latter half of his career, he was the fish curator at the Natural History Museum in London. And after all that, he decided to go and rear alpacas as a significant career change in his retirement. So he does have a story or two. So it's my pleasure to welcome to the Deep Sea Podcast, all the way from Bradford on Avon, Nigel Merrett. Thanks for joining us today.
A pleasure.
Your last trip to the deep sea was my first. Very minor overlap there, which is great.
That's right.
I was too young to really appreciate what, the opportunity I had. I could have sat down and learned all sorts of things. But at that point in my career, I'm just like, woohoo, this is exciting. But when we were talking about setting up this podcast, you sent me a little brief about your career. And I think we should go right back to that, how you got to the deep sea. So the first question is, you were on the last British whale factory in Antarctica. How? How does that come about?
Well, interestingly, at the end of my university career, jobs were not all that brilliant even 60 years ago. They were hard to find. And I saw an advert for supernumerary biologist, a job for the National Institute of Oceanography, who essentially had taken over from the discovery investigations at the British Museum the responsibility of looking into whale population dynamics and obviously the health of the populations down there. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, my great uncle had been the artist on Shackleton's expeditions to the Antarctic. And I'd always had a yen to go and see where he had been. And so whilst my first love was fish, I felt whales weren't very far from fish, really, just bigger. And so I applied and joined the ship in Newcastle in October and left it in May in Liverpool the year following. Quite a long trip, but a very interesting one.
Oh, there it was, yeah. I mean, I'd imagine these are pretty brutal working environments.
The Antarctic certainly is, and if you're at sea all the time, you see the vastness of the ocean and the huge swells, and they sort of equilibrated with the size of the prey that the whalers were going for. Of course, the whole climate around Wales and whaling has changed completely since then. The concern then was whether whaling would make species extinct, and very happily, it never did. It got very close, but the ships wore out, the men wore out before the whale populations. And so that was the very last pelagic one that Britain took part in.
After that, you ended up in Zanzibar.
I was very fortunate because I also applied on leaving university for a job working on tuna and marlin with the East African Common Services Organization at their laboratory in Zanzibar. And it so happened that my going away for 8 months coincided with the ship I was going to use, which was a 1906 hull trawler, going in for a refit. And so the director was quite happy for me to go off and join them pretty well a year later. That was a nice, seamless transition from very cold to very hot. Of course, I knew nothing about tuna. I was a young lad from the south of England, and tuna and marlin were not on the horizon in this country at all at that time. I had to learn quickly, and I learned far more quickly than I had anticipated, because as I got out there, a Japanese tuna longliner had been working in what was then Tanganyika and was in Dar es Salaam, just across the water from Zanzibar. And the director asked the captain if he would be prepared to take me for their next trip. It was unknown in the West, in European eyes, this system of longlining. And so the captain was persuaded to take this lone Englishman on board his ship for 3 months, it turned out. Quite a strain insofar as they had about 100 words of English among them. And of course, I had no Japanese at all. It was quite an isolated situation, but on the other hand, extremely interesting. I had to learn this longlining technique to train the African crew on the Zanzibar ship to carry out the sampling that I needed to do the biology and population studies that were asked of me. All in all, it was an extremely good experience. And I was very fortunate. I was invited back to the National Institute of Oceanography, this time to work on deep sea fish. It was at that point that I started working on oceanic species.
If my memory serves me correctly, going back to early 2001, the reason why we were both on the ship together was Monty brought you back out of retirement because he wanted you to teach us how to shoot the OTSB trawl. Now, and I may be completely off here, but my memory of that is you developed this based on, am I right in saying, a Mexican prawn trawl? You realized this would be a very efficient way of fishing at abyssal depth. Is that right?
Largely right. In the mid-70s, I was asked to start working on bottom fishes, demersal ones, and this was in the North Atlantic. The situation was that in the eastern North Atlantic, nobody had really looked over the edge of the slope and deeper. But Dick Heydrich and Ken Sulak in the United States had been working much deeper over there. And it struck me that if I was going to do anything meaningful on the eastern side, it would be a sensible thing at least to use the same gear. So we were able to make our catches in some way comparable. They were using this shrimp trawl, which was made in Biloxi, Mississippi. So I had one of those shipped over. And of course, having had no experience of trawling at all, I had to develop this system for a research vessel, which was very different from the shrimp trawlers that it had been designed for. What I did really was just develop it slightly and make sure that I could get the thing to the bottom, because of course you have to use what is known as a scope of 3:1, 3 times the length of wire out to the depth. And so if you're fishing at 4,000 meters, you've got to put out 12,000 meters of cable. First of all, you have to have it on the drums of the winch on the ship. Once you've got that, then yes. So there were little niceties that I could pass on to you people of how this was done, really. But I hadn't done very much gear development as such.
I think the last time I did an OTSB was the last time I was on Discovery. That must have been about 2011. But do you know when the boards are over the side and everything's ready and someone has to chain themselves to the deck, run up and kick the net over the aft?
That's right.
That was the best. That's my job. That's what I had to do in the end. I thought that was great. But you do nothing through the whole operation and then someone just goes, I'll do it, kick it.
Oh, well, yes, that's true. And of course, at roughly the same time, John Gordon from the Scottish Marine Biological Association was beginning a study of the Arctic Basin side of the Porcupine area. I began work off the Northwest African slope, an area of high diversity of slope dwellers, but it seemed better to move closer to home if possible and get some seasonal data. A good place looking at the chart would be the Porcupine sea bite, because there wasn't huge seeming distances between 500 and 4,000 meters depth of bottom. And so that was very close to where John Gordon was doing his work. So he and I joined up. He was using a much bigger trawl, a Granton trawl. So he was sampling a different spectrum of species to the one that the OTSB was sampling. So we were able to improve our knowledge in that sort of way.
Yeah. When the porcupine, abyssal plain, and sea biters went on to become one of the best studied areas in the world.
Yes.
I mean, really did.
And really, it was all to do with the fact that I wanted to get a few seasonal samples of the fishes. But there we are. It was
making it logistically easier for you, right? And it became this massive long-term observatory site.
Yes, and John and I worked for years there. In the end, we made a composite year of months. And then another interest, I got involved with sampling. I mean, I know we're talking about fishing all the time rather than fishes, but I got involved with sampling in that I was invited on a cruise of the Walter Herwig, the German research vessel, fisheries research vessel, and they had enormous trawls, things with mouth openings almost as big as football pitches, both for midwater and the bottom. And to be honest, you could hardly tell that the samples coming up from the bottom in the Porcupine sea bite on the slope there was in the same area to the ones that the small nets were catching. Because, of course, the big numbers of fish like the Synaphobranchus, the eel, which was by far the most abundant species represented in the OTSB, hardly appeared in the big trawls. And there were other species which we knew only from little larvae in the surface waters that were hugely abundant in the catches, things of sort of 6 feet long. It made me realize that sampling is all important. And of course, your work with Monty has demonstrated that again. You know, I was able, fortunately, to work with Monty quite a bit and try and understand what it was that you were looking at, because essentially you had to provide the right bait to get the sample, the cross-section of the population that you saw from your baited traps and cameras, whereas I was just dragging a net along and it was the old, infirm and too small that really got caught.
I think that there's no one sampling technique that will give you everything, right? I think you need a combination of all. And so what we see in the submarines is very different to what we see in the landers, which is very different to what comes up in traps. You kind of need them all. It's best to go out and just take a variety of equipment. And that's the only real way you will really understand it, or at least understand the limitations of your own gear, is to see how others work.
You have to get them all together and get as many sampling techniques as you can, I'm sure, is really the only thing. And what worries me a little is easily recognized things are fine, but if you don't have any specimens, then life becomes tricky. This is the thing about the biological oceanography in general, is that so little is known, even in the North Atlantic. There's still species in the North Atlantic that I'm sure have yet to be described. I found 2 new genera and several new species. You have to have an interest in taxonomy as well as ecology. I really started off as an ecologist and never lost my ecological interests. Nevertheless, more and more I realized that we have to have the material and we have to be able to identify it.
Yeah, the big problems we have is the diversity of grenadiers, because once you get up to like 1,000 meters, maybe 2,000 meters, especially along the North Atlantic continental shelf, there's so many species, and they're also cryptic as
right.
well, right? And then the big one we have, because we work real crazy deep, are the cuspioles, the old Bassizetus and stuff like that. And we know there's more than one there. You can see the proportions are never quite the same, and there's ones that, once you stare at these things for hours and hours, and then you can kind of mentally group, you can sort of decide among ourselves that there's at least 3 different ones there. But the places we go, no one's ever caught them from thousands of miles close to that place. And so we're in this kind of weird situation where they don't go into traps. We cannot trawl that deep anymore, but we're looking at them. We're staring them in the eye. And I'm not sure we're ever
Yes.
going to really know what exactly they are. So I think we're working on ways to try and get a bit smarter in terms of collecting, even just the vouchers. It doesn't have to be big, huge bottom trawl surveys, but if we can get a way of just bringing back 1 or 2 every deployment, then we can start building up that picture, because I think the deeper you go, the less options evolution has. And everything starts to look a bit same. Everything just ends up with an elongated tail and the small eyes. And yeah, especially the cuspioles. They are a problem we have to deal with on a daily basis. So speaking of fish, what's your big fish family? Everyone's got their favorite, right? Grenadiers?
I would think so, really, yes. They're all very interesting as groups. The ophidiforms are an interesting crowd. But I think you're right, the grenadiers.
2008, we did a survey off of West Africa, about 1,200 meters to, I think, 2,200 meters. And it was a quick job, get in, get out, oil company sponsored, West African oil fields. And the number of grenadiers there, I mean, they were in every conceivable shape, size, color. I've never seen anything quite like it. And we had a real hard time trying to make any sense of it from images. But because it's an oil field, we couldn't trawl. So we're relying a lot on your work. I remember specifically going through a lot of Ewan Marshall, I think, did some work
Yes,
off.
that's right.
And trying to unpick your trawl surveys from perhaps a couple of decades before and trying to marry that up with the likelihood of what we're seeing. And it was a hell of a job. But they're beautiful fish, but they don't give much away sometimes.
It wasn't easy for us either. Where were you, as a matter of interest?
Straight off the Congo.
Yes, you see, we were a bit farther north, well, mid-slope.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Zumias, for instance, were very diverse. I found one which in the end I called paramarshali, because there was a known marshali, but this beastly thing was not a marshali, but it was far closer than anything else, so it just had to be a paramarshali. That was quite a good size. It was probably about 40 centimeters. I don't think it's been caught since, or recorded at least.
Do you know how many species of fish you've described?
Gosh, I don't know. On my own, not many. I've described a few with other people. I suppose 40 or 50.
I know for a fact you've had 5 named after you, because I found that you've got a Wikipedia page. I was doing some stalking on you yesterday in preparation for this chat. So
you know more about me than I know about myself.
Do you know which 5 are yours?
I don't know about that, but I learnt a lot from the taxonomist, particularly Tomio Iwamoto. He and I were invited to look at the rat tails, the grenadiers, caught by the French off New Caledonia. In fact, we had a cruise on the New Zealand research ship, a French cruise on a New Zealand research ship. That was quite exciting. And so we were invited to identify these plus others, and we worked in Paris on them. And I was invited first off, and I went out and I had a look. I didn't know anything about the Pacific fauna, and I had some literature, not all of it, but I had a lot of the species which neatly sat between the Western Pacific group of species. These were all rat-tails, all grenadiers, and the Western Pacific ones. And I thought, this is a cline from one side to the other. So I'll try and bend my identification one way or the other. But in the end, I got pretty muddled and I left it. I didn't publish it. But I did ask the French if they would be good enough to get Tomio over, because he, of course, was the king of the grenadier taxonomy and had done an awful lot on the Pacific side. And he came over and we had a very interesting look at all these species. And he pointed out a very sensible course. He said, look, if something is different, name it. It doesn't matter if in later years it's shown to be a cline from the west to the east or whatever, but you have something which is named here and can be run to earth again. So we described several species there, which were probably going to be synonymized at some time later with a eastern or a western one, but at least it had put a marker down that there were things in between. That made me realize that taxonomy can be used very valuably from a, if you like, geographic even point of view.
It works the other way as well. And I think there's cases where there's been a very large population known, and with the onset of molecular and genetics, people have come in and said, well, no, there's actually two here. It's all one big game. It's a big puzzle. It's going to take a long time to resolve. And I think some of the Japanese work, they were the ones that came out with this extreme dimorphism where there wasn't it three species and three different families turned out to be different stages of the same life history of one.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, it was bizarre. It went through this massive eel-like phase and then became this other thing, and it ultimately became an anglerfish or whatever. I can't remember. It was really dramatic.
Absolutely so. And it was, names escape me. An American working in the Sydney Museum who was deeply involved with that as well.
Oh, John Paxton.
That's right, John Paxton. He'd been working on both forms as different forms. Yeah, that's right, John Paxton.
It's funny you should mention it, or we should be talking about him, because when I was doing my stalking of you, I came across a publication in the journal Copia, which was called a historical perspectives piece. I've never come across these before, but it was a tribute to Dan Cohen. But if you go down, and I'll send you this after this chat, if you go down to figure 4, there's a picture of all you lot sitting on the Vichas. There's John Paxton, there's you, there's Jürgen Nielsen, Eric Anderson, all these big names. There's about 8 of you sat there on this Russian vessel in the Indian Ocean.
That's right.
1988. And it must have been within months of the fall of the Soviet Union. It's like, how on earth did you pull that off?
Yeah, that was a very interesting cruise. We were a sort of international group invited by the Russians to partake in this cruise of the Vityaz, the new Vityaz, as it was then, in the area around the Mozambique Channel. And as you say, all those people were there, and we had a couple of very interesting months with the Russians, sampling in sort of slope waters. We didn't go very deep, but very interesting, quite different species. And the families were very recognizable, but species weren't in common with anything I had seen before.
The Indian Ocean's still like that. I'm sitting here in Perth on the edge of the Indian Ocean, and it is the ocean that no one really goes to. Lots of nations have polar initiatives on the go, and the North Pacific and North Atlantic are really well studied. But the Indian Ocean is just still to this day kind of just fallen off the radar a little bit. And so every time we go out to something, it's an untapped source of diversity that I don't think anyone's really got a handle on.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I do know that, having worked with Russian colleagues, and seen on that cruise, the Russians have a huge breadth and depth of data from that area generally, and much of it is fisheries data, but they have gleaned a great deal. The Sherzov Institute in Moscow did very well out of that from a sampling point of view, and they had some extremely good scientists there. It was an interesting trip.
I've sailed a few times with Justin Marshall, who was Freddie's son, and he's also been on
Yes,
the
of
podcast. He
course.
became quite the prominent scientist after all that. It was 2 generations. So sort of wrapping up a little bit, because we've talked about a lot of the big names and the interesting people, and we've talked about some of the sampling and the cruises and the fish. I mean, what would you think is the highlight of your deep sea era?
Gosh,
It is an area of science where I know that it does generate a lot of really good stories.
there are all sorts of things. You see, the thing is that I don't know if it's very different now. It probably isn't. But in those days, the international community that was working on deep sea stuff was really very small. And we got to know each other at meetings and cruises particularly. For instance, Jon Nielsen, I think he's coming up to his 93rd birthday in April, and he's still describing species. We talk regularly on the telephone. We've been at sea on all sorts of ships in all sorts of times, and they're always interesting stories. I suppose the biggest contribution that the NIO-IOS crowd made was the discrete sampling depths, being able to lower a net and have a mouth opening closing system so that you knew that the sample you got was a horizontal sample from a certain depth. Prior to that, you could only put a net down and catch stuff on the way down. You'd tow it over the majority of the time at a depth, and yes, you'd get most of those, but then you'd come back up again and get another bit of hazy data coming in. That was a very handy tool for understanding the diurnal migration and the depth distribution of things in the open ocean. It was very much a matter of each one of us building a little bit on top of other stuff. I mean, Monty's work stands out very clearly, of course, because he took a different line to the majority of us, and his understanding of technology, like yours, has added colossally to the understanding of things. I mean, look at those papers that you sent me just now, the oxygen in the swim bladders. Freddie Marshall did quite a lot of work, as I see you've referred to his work, but he did quite a lot on swim bladders and rather concluded that the deep living macrurids might be using the swim bladder mainly as a voice box, as it were.
He was looking at those little drumming muscles on the back of the swim bladder.
Yes, that's right. That organ in the middle of the swim bladder in concentric circles that he felt salted out the oxygen from the blood into the swim bladder. But your suggestions are that that would take years and years to do. So going at questions from different angles, and of course we have the technology now to really look at different angles.
I just thought it was really cool, that whole thing about, we put cameras down, I think it was just over 7,000 meters, and a grenadier turns up. And I flicked a picture to Monty and said, this thing has a swim bladder, and it's over 7 kilometers underwater. Even though he's long retired, he was immediately like, right, send me the video. And then that was it. Off he went. So yeah, we still work together. He loves it. He'll be listening to this interview. He will be listening when we put this out. So hi, Monty.
This is the way research goes, isn't it? We all crawl along incrementally in small steps behind somebody who has made a leap forward. And then we sort of wait, anticipating almost, but working alongside these questions. And then somebody else makes a quantum leap ahead, and then others can fill up the gaps. And that seems to be the way science works.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Nigel. I love these old stories. I do have a soft spot.
I could turn out quite a lot of those, I think.
I'm sure you could. Tom is also a very, very big fan of yours. Tom's the other guy on the podcast.
Oh,
and
yes.
He's now the fish curator at Te Papa in New Zealand. But unfortunately, he is somewhere in Antarctica, unknown.
So you said, yeah.
I've got quite
Lucky
sure where he's
man.
gone. Yeah, we've all done a few stints down there recently, but so he's there. So he's gutted. We've already interviewed James McLean, who I think took over from
Oh,
you.
have you? Good.
Yeah, he's a good friend of Tom's as well. So there's this sort of network of fish curators out there who are in touch.
He's a protege of mine. He did so well early on at the museum when he started off, and now he's holding the whole of the fish group together, it seems.
Thank you, Nigel. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for the chat.
And that concludes this episode of the Deep Sea Podcast. As ever, you can find out more on deepseapod.com, including ways you can send us questions, emails, and even record your own questions so we can play them on the show. The details will be in the show notes. And until next time, we miss you already, and we'll deep sea you next time.